When Tupac died, that was the final straw for me. I was like, see, this is too much. You know, niggas is getting shot even with Suge. Now that is it. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, you know what? I got to go. Because if this the case, I need to have the homies with me, and the homies need to get paid.
Death Row Records was supposed to be the most unstoppable movement in hip-hop, a kingdom built on street power, superstardom, and the iron grip of its CEO, Suge Knight. Inside that world, Kurupt wasn't just another rapper, he was a foundation, a core member of Dogg Pound, a lyrical assassin, and one of the few artists who lived through every era of Death Row's rise. But on the night Tupac Shakur died in Las Vegas, everything Kurupt believed about Death Row shattered at once. He wasn't just mourning a friend, he was waking up to a truth nobody inside the label wanted to admit out loud. If Tupac, the biggest star on the West Coast, a man rolling with security, power, and Suge himself, though could get taken out, then what did that mean for everybody else? Behind the cameras, behind the platinum plaques, behind the constant talk of brotherhood, Death Row wasn't invincible. It was a battlefield, a place where loyalty could save you one moment and bury you the next. And Kurupt knew it. For years, he ignored the fights, ignored the tension, ignored the chaos that came with being part of hip-hop's most feared empire. But the moment Pac's death hit the label, it exposed something terrifying. Even the tightest circle in rap couldn't protect its own. And that's when Kurupt made the hardest choice of his life. He walked away. Not because of money, not because of contracts, but because he realized Death Row wasn't a record label anymore. It was a place where legends could die, and no one inside was safe. This is the story of the moment Kurupt finally said, enough. Rising through the chaos. Before the danger, before the headlines, before Death Row became a symbol of fear, it was a dream. And for Kurupt, that dream started in 1992 when he walked into a label that felt like the future of West Coast rap. The place was raw, loud, and unpredictable, but it was filled with talent that could change the world. Dr. Dre was sculpting the sound of a generation. Snoop Dogg was becoming a cultural giant. Daz was crafting beats that shook the ground. And Kurupt, he came in young, hungry, and ready to prove he belonged with the best. Death Row was chaotic from day one, but for Kurupt, the chaos wasn't a problem. It was part of the magic. Fights broke out, tensions sparked, and egos clashed. But inside those walls, the music was untouchable. Long studio nights at Can-Am and Tarzana were legendary. Kurupt and Daz would bounce off each other, writing verses at lightning speed while Dre locked in behind the board, shaping the sound that would define the 90s. But even in those early years, the warning signs were there. Suge's presence was already larger than life. Security patrolled every hallway. Affiliates from the streets drifted in and out of the building. Everyone felt the pressure, but they also felt protected, because being on Death Row meant you had power behind you, and for young artists like Kurupt, that power felt like a shield. Still, there was an energy building beneath the surface. Dre's frustration, Snoop's uncertainty, a growing sense that the label wasn't just a music empire, it was a pressure cooker. But back then, Kurupt didn't care. He wasn't thinking about consequences or danger. He was thinking about legacy, bars, and the next track they were about to destroy. What he didn't know was that everything, the vibe, the brotherhood, even the sense of safety, it would change forever the moment Tupac walked through the door. The shift after Pac's release. When Tupac hit Death Row in late 1995, the entire atmosphere flipped overnight. Before Pac, the label already had intensity. But once he walked into Can-Am Studios, the energy went from charged to explosive. Kurupt remembered those days vividly. Pac didn't ease his way into the building like a new artist. He stormed in like a man on a mission, recording non-stop, pushing everybody around him to go harder, and turning the studio into a battlefield of creativity. Pac's presence brought adrenaline, but also pressure. He demanded speed, passion, and absolute loyalty. Kurupt respected that immediately. To him, Pac was family from day one. They bonded over bars, long studio nights, and a shared hunger to be the best. Pac pushed Kurupt to sharpen every verse, every flow, every moment in the booth. Kurupt wasn't just inspired, he felt reborn as an artist. But the arrival of Pac also magnified the cracks that had already been forming inside Death Row. Dr. Dre had one foot out the door, tired of the chaos and politics. Snoop was caught between frustration and loyalty, and Suge, seeing Pac as the new centerpiece of the label, began relying on him in ways that shifted the internal balance. Decisions became faster, riskier, and often more dangerous. Suddenly, Death Row didn't feel like the home it once was. It felt like it was accelerating. Too fast, too wild, too close to the edge. The arguments were louder. The studio was more crowded. The visitors were more unpredictable. And the line between music and street politics blurred more than ever. Still, for Kurupt, Pac made it worth it. His drive made you ignore the danger. His confidence made you forget the risk. And his brotherhood made everyone believe the label was unstoppable. But that illusion wouldn't last long. The Vegas trip was coming. And it would expose the truth nobody wanted to face. The night in Vegas.
It was like, damn, it's that serious? And he was like, man, they say he's really hurt.
September 7th, 1996. To the world, it was just another heavyweight fight night in Las Vegas. To Death Row, it was supposed to be a celebration, a show of power, unity, and dominance. Pac was fresh off one of the most unstoppable creative runs in rap history. Suge was still the most feared CEO in the game, and the entire camp moved like nothing could touch them. Vegas was their playground that night, but the celebration didn't last. When word spread that Pac and Suge had both been hit in a drive-by shooting on Flamingo Road, the entire Death Row circle felt the ground drop beneath them. Kurupt wasn't there, but he remembers the moment he got the call. Shock, confusion, disbelief. Not Pac, not the man who survived everything, not the man who took bullets before and still walked out stronger. It didn't seem real. Inside the Death Row camp, panic wasn't a rumor. It was the atmosphere. People were crying, arguing, making calls, scrambling for information. Kurupt later said that everyone assumed Pac would pull through because he always did. He was larger than life, impossible to imagine laid out in a hospital bed fighting for breath. But as the hours passed, the updates got worse. The tension thickened, and the illusion of Death Row's invincibility cracked in half. For Kurupt, that night wasn't just about fear, it was about realization. If Pac could be hit while rolling with Suge himself, inside a convoy surrounded by people, then nobody inside Death Row was safe. Not Snoop, not Daz, not Kurupt. The protection they thought they had wasn't real. The streets didn't care about fame, power, or reputation, and when the news broke 6 days later that Tupac Shakur had died, everything that held Death Row together began to collapse, including Kurupt's faith in the label he once called home. Passie's death breaks the spell. When Tupac died on September 13th, 1996, Death Row didn't just lose an artist, it lost the force that held the entire empire together. Inside the label, Pac wasn't just the star. He was the shield, the spark, the voice that made everyone feel like the chaos was worth it. And once he was gone, the air inside Death Row turned cold. Kurupt felt it immediately. The hallways at Can-Am weren't buzzing with excitement anymore. The energy that once pushed everyone to work harder now turned into a fog of grief, paranoia, and uncertainty. People whispered instead of shouted. Artists stopped coming around as often. Meetings turned tense, smiles disappeared. And the biggest shift of all, the feeling of protection was gone. Pac dying on Suge's watch wasn't something Kurupt could brush off. This wasn't a random tragedy to him, it was proof. Proof that the empire wasn't invincible. Proof that the streets could still reach anyone. Proof that even riding with the most feared man in the industry didn't guarantee survival. Kurupt later said that moment snapped him out of everything. The loyalty, the bravado, the belief that Death Row was family. Suddenly, he wasn't thinking about music or legacy. He was thinking about survival. If Pac could die like that, what would stop it from happening to Snoop, to Daz, to him? The label didn't resemble the place he had joined back in 1992. Back then, Death Row felt like a movement with a purpose. Now, it felt like a storm cloud that refused to let any light through. Friends turned distant affiliates became unpredictable. Calls went unanswered. People he trusted started disappearing one by one. And Kurupt realized something that stayed with him forever. Pac didn't just die, Pac's death exposed Death Row. And once you saw the truth, you couldn't unsee it. Suge's control and the fear factor. After Pac died, Death Row didn't slow down. It spiraled, and the man at the center of that storm was Suge. Even before he went to prison, you could feel his grip tightening. He was still feared, still respected, but now he was unpredictable. The loss of Pac hit him too, and instead of easing the pressure, it made him clamp down on everything and everyone around him. Kurupt watched as the atmosphere inside the label changed from intense to suffocating. Death Row had always been a place with rules, Suge's rules. But after Pac's death, those rules turned into shadows that followed everybody. People talked less. They moved quietly. Studio sessions had more security than artists. And every decision felt like it came with consequences nobody wanted to face. When Suge got locked up shortly after Pac's death for the MGM altercation, the label didn't stabilize. It fractured. Without him physically present, the structure collapsed even further. Associates from different sets tried to fill the vacuum, and the lines between business and street life blurred even more. Kurupt wasn't afraid of the streets. He grew up in them. But Death Row wasn't the same type of energy. This wasn't about being tough. This was about being surrounded by people who had nothing to lose. Kurupt noticed the conversations change. Instead of talking about albums or tours, people whispered about threats, money owed, internal beefs, and who wasn't welcome anymore. Even simple studio nights felt like something could go left at any moment. The tension was thick enough to feel in the air. And then came the moment that stuck with him. Conversations about artists getting pressed, people getting followed, and the realization that the danger wasn't random. It was becoming routine. Kurupt said it plainly years later. If Ngis is getting shot around you, that's a sign. Death Row wasn't a label anymore. It was a battlefield with microphones, and Kurupt knew staying meant gambling with his life. The breaking point.
You know, niggas is getting shot even with Suge. Now that is it.
By late 1996 and early 1997, the warning signs weren't subtle anymore. They were flashing in Kurupt's face. Every week brought a new story, a new conflict, or a new reminder that Death Row wasn't just unstable. It was dangerous. Artists were distancing themselves. Producers were leaving. Even the engineers, the people who never took sides, were trying to find work elsewhere. Everyone felt the shift. For Kurupt, it wasn't one incident. It was everything piling up at once. The tension in the studio, the unpredictable energy in the halls, the constant pressure from street affiliates who seemed more involved than actual label staff, the money conversations that didn't make sense, and the silence from people he used to trust, the silence that made him realize the old Death Row was never coming back. But the real breaking point came when he started hearing firsthand stories about what was happening to people around the label. Harassment, threats, even people getting followed. These weren't rumors in magazines. These were conversations with people he grew up with, people he made music with, people who never exaggerated. When they said they felt unsafe, Kurupt listened, and when someone told him straight up that loyalty wasn't going to protect anyone anymore, it hit him like a punch. In one interview, Kurupt said a moment came when he looked around and realized, if Pac could die, what makes me think I can't? And that wasn't paranoia. That was survival instinct. Pac's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was proof that the chaos could reach anybody, no matter how big their name was or who they stood next to. Kurupt didn't want to be next. He didn't want Daz to be next. He didn't want his family dealing with headlines instead of phone calls. So the decision formed quietly in his mind. He had to leave, not for money, not for ego, but because staying meant risking everything, including his life. Leaving Death Row. When Kurupt finally made the decision to leave Death Row, it wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a public announcement or a staged moment. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes from someone who has seen enough and knows there's no turning back. Inside, he was done. The danger, the tension, the loss of Pac. It all stacked up until walking away became the only option that made sense. But leaving Death Row wasn't as simple as packing a bag and saying goodbye. This was the most feared label in America. Artists didn't just dip without consequences. The streets were tied into the building. Loyalties ran deep. And Suge's presence, even from behind bars, was still felt in every corner of the industry. So when Kurupt stepped away, people noticed. And not everyone was happy. The backlash came fast. Some people around the label felt betrayed. Others accused him of abandoning the movement. There were whispers, threats, and rumors that he'd never work in the industry again. And perhaps the most painful part of all, the tension it created with Daz. The brothers who built Dogg Pound together suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a label divide neither of them asked for. Kurupt didn't lash back. He didn't start a war. He simply focused on survival. He focused on music. He focused on staying alive long enough to make sure his story didn't end the way Pax did. The industry watched closely. Because when someone as loyal as Kurupt walked away, people knew something inside Death Row was deeply broken. His exit sent shockwaves through Los Angeles. If a foundational member of Death Row Records chose freedom over power, how bad had things really gotten? Kurupt didn't need to explain it. His absence said everything. Rebuilding after escape. When Kurupt stepped outside of Death Row, the world felt different. He wasn't surrounded by security anymore. He wasn't walking into studios stacked with affiliates and tension. For the first time in years, he could breathe. But freedom came with a strange silence. After leaving a label as powerful and feared as Death Row, the phone doesn't ring the same way people hesitate. They watch from a distance. Everyone wants to see how you move. But Kurupt wasn't lost. He wasn't broken. He was rebuilding. He reunited with people who genuinely cared about him. He reconnected with Snoop, who was navigating his own escape route out of the Death Row shadow. And slowly, Kurupt started carving out his next chapter. A chapter filled with creativity instead of conflict. He signed new deals. He got back in the studio with Daz after the tension cooled down. Dogg Pound found its way back together. And Kurupt rediscovered what it meant to make music without looking over his shoulder. He wasn't trying to chase the Death Row sound anymore. He was focused on longevity, artistry, and staying alive in an industry where surviving the 90s wasn't guaranteed. Meanwhile, outside the studio, Kurupt started speaking openly about what he'd been through. Years later, when he reflected on the past, his tone was calmer, mature, not angry, just honest. He talked about the danger, the loyalty, the love he had for the people inside that building. And he also talked about why he had to walk away. That's where Snoop's story from the Revolt TV interview hits hard. When Snoop explained how Suge felt disappointed he couldn't control certain people, it painted a clear picture. Kurupt wasn't just walking away from danger. He was walking away from someone who needed control to keep the empire standing. And Kurupt realized something powerful during that time. You can love where you came from. You can respect what you built, but you don't have to die for it. Rebuilding wasn't about reinvention. It was about survival, clarity, and finally choosing himself over the myth of Death Row. What Kurupt's exit meant for Death Row. When Kurupt walked away from Death Row, it wasn't just another artist leaving a label. It was a signal. One the entire industry felt immediately. Kurupt wasn't a side character. He was one of the original soldiers of the Death Row dynasty. He helped shape its sound, held its identity together when things got shaky, and represented loyalty in a place built on it. So when he left, people didn't see an artist switching labels. They saw a foundation cracking. Inside Death Row, the effects were instant. Daz felt the loss deeply. Snoop was already halfway out emotionally. Dr. Dre had been gone for months. Pac was gone forever. And with Kurupt's departure, the label's backbone and the chemistry, the unity, the creative fire disappeared piece by piece. Executives, producers, and artists watched as the empire that once dominated the 90s began bleeding talent faster than it could replace it. Kurupt leaving made it clear that the problems inside Death Row weren't just rumors or media exaggerations. They were real, internal, and dangerous enough to push out someone who was never afraid of pressure, competition, or confrontation. Even people outside the label took notice. Other artists in LA started distancing themselves. Collaboration slowed. The mystique of Death Row, the untouchable label, shifted into a warning. If someone as loyal as Kurupt ran for his life, what chance would anyone else have? And for Suge, Kurupt's exit hit a deeper nerve. It wasn't just about losing an artist. It was about losing control over the narrative. the label, and the people who once saw him as unshakable years later. Even Suge himself admitted on his podcast and in interviews that watching artists walk away was painful because he built the empire for them. But by the time he realized how fragile the empire had become, it was too late. Kurupt's exit didn't kill Death Row, but it exposed the truth. Death Row wasn't collapsing because of enemies. It was collapsing from the inside, one departure at a time. And when someone like Kurupt left, the entire world finally understood that the fall of Death Row wasn't a mystery. It was inevitable. The last straw that broke the empire. Kurupt didn't leave Death Row for fame, money, or a better contract. He left because Tupac's death revealed something terrifying, that no one inside the label was protected anymore. The empire that once felt larger than life was suddenly exposed as vulnerable, chaotic, and unpredictable. For Kurupt, that was the moment everything changed. He had watched the label grow from a raw, explosive movement into the most feared powerhouse in hip-hop. He had lived through the studio nights, the tension, the loyalty, and the pressure. But when Pac died under Suge's watch, the illusion shattered. If the biggest artist in the world could get taken out while rolling with the most feared CEO in the industry, then the danger wasn't outside. It was in the foundation itself. Kurupt's exit wasn't betrayal. It was survival. It was wisdom. It was a man recognizing that no amount of loyalty was worth gambling his life. And the moment he walked away, the industry understood something they weren't supposed to see. Death Row wasn't invincible. It was bleeding. After Kurupt left, the decline accelerated. More artists distanced themselves. More deals fell apart. And the empire Suge built with iron hands began collapsing under its own weight. But through it all, Kurupt stayed solid. He rebuilt, he evolved, and he kept the legacy of Dogg Pound alive. Without the shadow of death hanging over him, Kurupt's story isn't just about leaving Death Row. It's about seeing the truth before it was too late. If you were in his position, loyal to the core but surrounded by danger, would you have stayed, or would you have walked away like Kurupt did? Drop your thoughts in the comments, like the video if you learned something new, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the hidden stories of hip-hop's most powerful moments.